Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. The Whitmore Diner stood at the edge of Maple Street in a small Vermont town where winters were long and reputations lasted longer. Ivy Whitmore had learned the rhythm of that place before she learned advanced algebra. At dawn, she brewed coffee strong enough to wake exhausted lumber workers. By midnight, she wiped down counters while her widowed mother, Eleanor Whitmore, balanced receipts with tired but dignified precision. After Ivy's father died of a sudden heart attack when she was 17, college brochures stopped being dreams and started becoming negotiations. She had earned a full scholarship to study finance in Boston, but when the diner nearly collapsed under mounting debt and a failing refrigeration unit, Ivy made a decision no one asked her to make. She deferred her admission and stayed. She studied accounting textbooks between orders, sketched repayment plans in the margins of grocery lists, and renegotiated supplier contracts with a calm voice that surprised grown men twice her age. The diner stabilized slowly, not through miracles but through disciplined adjustments Ivy implemented quietly. She ran 5 miles every morning along the frozen lake to clear her mind, and in the evenings, she restored old wooden chairs salvaged from estate sales, sanding and polishing them into something sturdy again. Stability fascinated her more than glamour. She wanted to build things that endured storms. She did not yet know how much of her life would become a test of that belief. Graham Whitmore first walked into the diner on a snow-heavy afternoon wearing a navy parka and carrying a clipboard from the regional freight company where he worked as a delivery coordinator. He ordered black coffee and stayed longer than necessary, scanning spreadsheets on his tablet while occasionally glancing toward Ivy as she organized inventory in the back office. Unlike the men who flirted clumsily or spoke loudly about small-town boredom, Graham asked thoughtful questions. He noticed Ivy's annotated ledger books and commented on her precise handwriting. Their first real conversation happened over a malfunctioning invoice printer. He fixed the paper jam while she recalculated a vendor dispute in her head faster than his calculator. There was no thunderbolt romance, only intellectual curiosity and mutual respect. Graham spoke about inefficiencies in freight routing and how small brokers were being crushed by national chains. Ivy listened, challenged assumptions, and suggested cost flow tracking methods he hadn't considered. Something shifted in his eyes then, not just attraction, but recognition. For the first time, someone saw beyond the waitress apron and into the strategic mind behind it. The diner lights hummed above them as snow fell outside, and neither realized they were standing at the quiet beginning of something that would reshape both their lives. Eleanor noticed before Ivy did. Mothers who survive loss develop an instinct for future storms. She watched Graham's posture when Ivy spoke, how he leaned forward, how he listened. She also noticed his ambition, sharp and restless. One evening after closing, Eleanor folded napkins while Ivy scrubbed the grill, and she asked gently whether Ivy had considered returning to school. Ivy hesitated. She spoke about long-term capital growth models and her idea of someday creating a consultancy for struggling family businesses like theirs. She wanted to prevent other widows from standing alone in debt negotiations. Eleanor smiled but warned her daughter not to lose herself in someone else's dream. Ivy brushed the concern aside, convinced partnership meant shared ascent. Outside, Graham waited in his truck to drive her home through icy roads, speaking animatedly about market gaps in regional logistics. Ivy felt excitement she hadn't felt since receiving her scholarship letter. The town remained small, the diner modest, but the horizon felt larger. What Ivy could not yet see was that ambition, when mixed with insecurity, can become a slow-burning fuse. For now, though, there was only snow, coffee steam, and the fragile hope of 2 young people daring to believe they could build something greater together. Spring arrived slowly in Vermont, melting the ice along Lake Champlain into silver ripples that reflected a sky just beginning to warm. Graham invited Ivy to a lakeside picnic one Sunday afternoon, insisting he needed fresh air to think clearly. He spread out a blanket near the water, papers tucked under his arm, his energy restless but focused. Ivy brought homemade sandwiches from the diner and a thermos of strong coffee, practical as always. The lake breeze carried a scent of pine and possibility as Graham began speaking about his vision, not just coordinating deliveries, but building his own freight brokerage firm. He described regional gaps in supply chains, small manufacturers who were underserved, and the inefficiencies that frustrated him daily. Ivy listened without interruption, studying the seriousness in his tone. This wasn't casual ambition, it was a blueprint forming in real time. He admitted he feared staying small more than he feared failure. That vulnerability struck her. She saw in him the same hunger she had felt when balancing the diner's failing accounts. Yet where she craved stability, Graham craved recognition. As the wind shifted across the water, he turned to her and asked quietly whether she thought he was capable of building something larger than the town that shaped him. Ivy did not answer with flattery. Instead, she pulled out a notepad from her tote bag and began sketching potential startup costs, operating margins, and contingency reserves. She explained that ambition without structure collapses under pressure, but ambition with disciplined planning becomes durable. Graham watched her calculate fuel overhead scenarios and vendor retention strategies with effortless clarity. He had expected encouragement, he received strategic partnership. Their conversation stretched for hours, drifting from freight routes to leadership philosophy. Ivy challenged him to define what success meant beyond public applause. He admitted he wanted validation, proof that he was more than a dockworker's son from a small town. She understood that ache. Her father had worked tirelessly without ever hearing applause. Still, she warned him that chasing recognition alone could hollow a person. Graham nodded, though something in his expression suggested he believed he could outrun that risk. When the sun dipped lower, he reached for her hand with gratitude rather than romance. It was a subtle but profound connection. They were building something intellectual first, emotional second. Later that evening, Graham introduced Ivy to his younger brother, Miles Whitmore, at a modest lakeside bonfire gathering. Miles, a thoughtful high school history teacher, carried himself with quiet skepticism masked by politeness. He listened as Graham enthusiastically outlined his brokerage dream and Ivy's preliminary financial framework. Miles observed more than he spoke, but when he finally addressed Ivy directly, his tone held cautious admiration. He asked whether she planned to return to her scholarship someday. The question lingered heavier than intended. Ivy answered honestly that timing was complicated. Miles exchanged a glance with Graham that Ivy did not fully decode, but it hinted at protective concern. As the fire crackled and laughter echoed from neighbors, Miles pulled Graham aside briefly, urging him not to let ambition consume partnership. Graham dismissed the caution with a confident grin. Ivy watched from a distance, sensing undercurrents she could not yet define. The lake reflected moonlight, calm on the surface, but beneath it currents moved in directions unseen. And somewhere within that calm, the seeds of both greatness and fracture were quietly planted. The offer letter from the Boston finance firm arrived on a Thursday afternoon, thick paper embossed with promise. Ivy held it in her hands while standing in the back office of the diner, her heart beating in complicated rhythms. The internship would place her on a fast track toward the career she had once imagined: structured corporate finance, mentorship under seasoned analysts, and exposure to large-scale capital management. That same evening, Graham sat across from her at their kitchen table, spreading out draft projections for what he was now calling Whitmore Logistics. He spoke with contagious excitement about renting a small office space and acquiring his first independent freight clients. Ivy listened carefully, weighing the timing against the offer letter folded in her apron pocket. When she finally told him about the internship, Graham's expression flickered, pride first, then something harder to name. He congratulated her, yet he also asked whether she believed long distance would strain their momentum. The question lingered in the air. Ivy knew what the right financial move was for her future. She also knew what loyalty demanded in the present. By midnight, she had drafted a respectful email declining the internship, convincing herself she could return to that path later. Graham embraced her, grateful and energized, unaware that the foundation of his company now rested on a sacrifice he did not fully comprehend. Long nights followed. The diner closed at 10, but Ivy's work rarely ended before 2 in the morning. She sat at the small dining table, laptop open, building spreadsheets that mapped potential client acquisition costs, projected freight margins, and quarterly risk buffers. Graham paced the room while dictating ideas about branding and outreach strategies, occasionally pausing to kiss her forehead in appreciation. Ivy's training in finance allowed her to see inefficiencies in his assumptions quickly. She adjusted routing expense estimates and negotiated fuel rate clauses into preliminary contracts he hadn't even secured yet. The stress was real, but so was the sense of shared construction. They ate reheated leftovers at midnight and fell asleep surrounded by stacks of draft proposals. In quiet moments, Ivy imagined what their partnership might look like in 10 years, equal architects of a stable enterprise. She did not crave applause, she craved security built on intelligent design. Meanwhile, Graham grew increasingly animated when describing investor meetings he hoped to secure. His language began to shift subtly from we to I, though Ivy dismissed it as nervous excitement. She trusted the work would speak for itself. Across town, in a sleek office belonging to a competing freight firm, Bianca Hale accepted a position as executive assistant to the regional director. Polished, observant, and socially strategic, Bianca had grown up in a wealthy household where achievement was currency and affection was conditional. She had no patience for small-town modesty and studied power dynamics like a language she intended to master fluently. During an industry networking mixer weeks later, she first heard Graham speak about launching his own brokerage. She noticed his charisma and ambition immediately. More importantly, she recognized his hunger for validation, a trait she knew how to leverage. While Ivy returned home after late diner shifts to continue refining logistics projections, Bianca quietly observed the rising competitor with interest. She admired bold ambition but dismissed unseen contributors. In her worldview, public recognition defined value. And somewhere between Ivy's quiet spreadsheets and Bianca's calculating observation, the first silent contrast emerged, two very different women orbiting the same rising star, each understanding ambition in entirely different ways. The wedding took place in early autumn inside a refurbished barn on the outskirts of town, the wooden beams still carrying the scent of hay and varnish. It was modest but warm, illuminated by strings of soft golden lights that Ivy had insisted on installing herself to save costs. Eleanor moved through the crowd with quiet pride, introducing her daughter as if she had built the entire evening by hand. Arthur Whitmore shook guests' hands with rough palms shaped by decades of dock work, while Nora Whitmore clasped Ivy's hands tenderly, whispering that she had always hoped Graham would find someone grounded. Miles stood beside his brother as best man, his expression thoughtful rather than exuberant. When Graham vowed partnership, he spoke with conviction about building an empire together. Ivy's vows were steadier, centered on resilience, loyalty, and shared purpose. There was no extravagance, only sincerity. Yet beneath the rustic simplicity lingered a subtle imbalance. Graham's promises radiated forward ambition, while Ivy's promised endurance. The barn doors opened briefly during the ceremony, letting in a gust of cool wind that made the candles flicker. It felt like a quiet omen, though no one recognized it as such. Married life began in a small two-bedroom house financed partly by Ivy's meticulous savings and partly by a modest bank loan she negotiated personally. The house needed work, creaking floors, outdated cabinets, but Ivy found satisfaction in restoring it slowly. On weekends she stripped layers of old paint from wooden furniture, sanding patiently while Graham took business calls from the porch. She balanced the company's early invoices in the evenings, reviewing client payment timelines and drafting cash flow protections. Graham began meeting local manufacturers to pitch Whitmore Logistics, returning home animated by progress reports. At first, he consulted Ivy on every contract, leaning heavily on her analytical instincts. She helped him avoid risky agreements that could have crippled them financially. Arthur often visited, offering practical advice about staying humble. Nora brought homemade pies and watched how Ivy managed household accounts with the same discipline she applied to business spreadsheets. There was a sense of momentum, small but promising. Yet as the company gained minor traction, Graham's posture began to shift subtly. He enjoyed introducing himself as founder and CEO, relishing the authority those titles carried. While Ivy quietly managed operational costs, Graham started attending local business mixers alone, claiming networking required independence. He spoke about scaling quickly and attracting larger investors. At one such event, he crossed paths again with Bianca Hale, now confidently established within industry circles. She congratulated him on launching his firm and praised his visionary courage. The compliment lingered longer than it should have. At home that evening, Ivy presented a careful mortgage amortization plan that would allow them to reduce long-term interest. Graham listened but seemed distracted, replaying Bianca's admiration in his mind. Ivy noticed the distraction yet attributed it to exhaustion. She believed in the partnership they had vowed before family and friends. The house slowly transformed under her steady hands, and the company's foundation strengthened because of her foresight. But ambition, once tasted publicly, can become intoxicating. Graham began craving rooms where applause was louder than gratitude. And though their marriage still appeared solid from the outside, the first hairline fracture formed quietly between shared labor and individual recognition. The warehouse smelled of diesel and cold metal the morning Graham pitched Whitmore Logistics to Northern Ridge Manufacturing, a mid-sized equipment supplier struggling with delayed shipments. Ivy stood slightly behind him at the conference table, not introduced formally but present by design. She had spent weeks studying Northern Ridge's distribution inefficiencies, identifying unnecessary middle route stops and inflated carrier costs. While Graham delivered a confident presentation about reliability and scalability, Ivy quietly passed him annotated figures at key moments, adjusting his projections in real time when executives raised objections. When the procurement director challenged fuel fluctuation risks, it was Ivy's contingency clause, drafted at 2 a.m, that sealed the reassurance they needed. The room shifted. Heads nodded. Graham concluded with polished confidence, and by the end of the meeting, Whitmore Logistics secured its first major contract. As they stepped into the crisp morning air, Graham lifted Ivy briefly in celebration. It felt like validation of every late night and sacrificed opportunity. For a moment, they were equal architects of breakthrough success. The celebration that followed, however, unfolded differently. At a local chamber luncheon arranged hastily by Northern Ridge's CEO, Graham stood at the podium recounting the company's rapid growth story. He spoke about bold risk-taking, strategic instinct, and relentless determination. Ivy sat at a back table beside Miles and Nora, listening carefully. Her spreadsheets and risk buffers were reduced to a passing remark about solid back-end support. The applause centered on Graham's narrative of singular vision. Miles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward Ivy with quiet concern. Nora squeezed Ivy's hand gently beneath the tablecloth, sensing the imbalance even if others did not. Ivy smiled politely and told herself that public credit mattered less than structural stability. She believed recognition would balance naturally over time. Yet something subtle had shifted. Graham had tasted public applause unshared, and it felt powerful. When he returned to their table, flushed with compliments, he barely noticed Ivy's steady silence. Later that evening, Claudia Reeves stopped by the house with a celebratory cake from her bakery. Claudia had known Ivy since childhood and possessed an instinct for unspoken truths. As Graham animatedly retold the luncheon speech, Claudia observed the careful omissions. After he stepped outside to take a congratulatory call, Claudia turned to Ivy with raised brows. She asked whether Ivy was comfortable remaining invisible behind the curtain. Ivy dismissed the concern, insisting partnership did not require spotlight equality. Claudia countered bluntly that disappearing too far behind someone else's ambition can make reappearance difficult. The conversation lingered long after Claudia left. Graham returned inside radiant with ambition, already discussing scaling faster, hiring an executive assistant, and pursuing larger contracts. Ivy listened thoughtfully, calculating operational strain in her mind. The breakthrough contract had opened a door, but it had also illuminated a new hunger in Graham. And hunger, if left unchecked, rarely remains satisfied with just one victory. The corporate gala invitation arrived embossed in silver, addressed solely to Mr. Graham Whitmore, founder and CEO, Whitmore Logistics. Ivy noticed the omission of her name but said nothing, folding the card carefully and placing it on the kitchen counter. The event was hosted in Burlington at an upscale hotel ballroom filled with regional investors, manufacturing executives, and transportation brokers. Graham insisted he attend alone, explaining that optics mattered and that investors preferred streamlined leadership representation. Ivy nodded, though she had prepared half the financial forecast that secured the invitation. That evening, while Graham adjusted his tie before the mirror, Ivy reviewed outstanding invoices at the dining table, balancing accounts to ensure liquidity remained stable during expansion. At the gala, Graham found himself surrounded by polished professionals discussing growth capital and acquisition strategies. He thrived in the atmosphere, energized by attention. It was there that Bianca Hale re-entered his orbit formally, now introduced as a strategic executive assistant to her firm's director. She complimented Graham's rising profile and subtly suggested he consider modernizing his leadership image. The suggestion lingered longer than it should have. When Graham returned home after midnight, his tone carried a new sharpness masked as ambition. He spoke about branding upgrades, potential investors who expected rapid scaling, and the importance of appearing refined. Ivy listened carefully, asking measured questions about operational capacity and debt exposure. Graham waved off her caution, insisting risk was necessary for recognition. Within weeks, he announced he would be hiring an executive assistant to streamline communication and investor relations. Ivy supported the decision pragmatically, drafting a clear job description that emphasized logistical coordination. Yet when Bianca Hale appeared for the interview, impeccably dressed and speaking fluently about corporate image management, Graham's decision seemed preordained. Bianca was hired swiftly. She reorganized his schedule, filtered emails, and subtly positioned herself as gatekeeper between Graham and the rest of the company. Ivy noticed that some of her direct communications with clients now passed through Bianca first. It was a structural shift disguised as efficiency. Graham began spending longer hours at the new rented office downtown, attending networking dinners where Ivy's presence was deemed unnecessary. At home, the shift became harder to ignore. Graham criticized small details: how Ivy dressed for local supplier meetings, how she phrased emails, how she prioritized conservative budgeting over aggressive expansion. He framed these critiques as strategic improvements, but the undertone was unmistakable. Bianca's influence extended beyond scheduling. She encouraged Graham to consider investor-backed growth, hinting that caution could be mistaken for weakness. Meanwhile, Ivy continued managing accounts meticulously, aware that cash reserves were thinner than Graham realized. She sensed a widening emotional distance but chose patience over confrontation. Miles visited one evening and observed the tension immediately. After Graham left to take a late-night call arranged by Bianca, Miles asked Ivy quietly whether she still felt like a partner. Ivy hesitated before answering. She believed in loyalty, in slow-building success, in resilience. Yet as the house grew quieter and Graham's ambitions grew louder, she began to feel the subtle erosion of shared ground beneath her feet. The argument began over something deceptively small, an invoice discrepancy Ivy had flagged during her routine review of the company's accounts. She noticed an unusually large consulting fee processed under a discretionary category and asked Graham about it during dinner. He barely looked up from his phone before dismissing her concern, explaining that strategic advisory costs were necessary for accelerated growth. Ivy pressed gently, requesting documentation for transparency and long-term stability. Graham's patience thinned. He accused her of clinging to small-town caution while he was trying to compete in a larger arena. The words landed heavier than he intended, but he did not retract them. Ivy sat still, absorbing the criticism quietly. She had always believed her caution protected them. Now it was being framed as limitation. The dining table that once hosted shared planning sessions felt like a negotiation battlefield. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows, mirroring the growing chill inside the room. Graham's tone sharpened as he continued. He insisted that bold leaders did not second-guess every expense and that she needed to trust his instincts. Ivy responded calmly, reminding him that risk without guardrails could undo years of disciplined progress. He interpreted her caution as lack of faith rather than strategic balance. The conversation escalated into a heated exchange about vision versus restraint. For the first time, Graham suggested that perhaps Ivy's background made her uncomfortable with rapid success. The comment cut deeper than he realized. She had sacrificed opportunities precisely to support his ambition, yet now her prudence was being weaponized against her. The argument ended not with resolution but with silence. Graham left the house abruptly, claiming he had a late meeting. Ivy remained seated long after the door closed, replaying every word in her mind. She was not afraid of growth, she was afraid of collapse disguised as growth. But fear, when unspoken, becomes isolation. Later that week, Miles confronted Graham privately after noticing the tension during a family visit. Arthur and Nora had sensed it too, though they avoided direct involvement. Miles, however, was less inclined to remain neutral. He met Graham at a quiet diner off the interstate and challenged him about the shift in his behavior. Graham dismissed concerns as jealousy of his progress, accusing Miles of lacking ambition as a teacher. The accusation stunned Miles but did not silence him. He reminded Graham that arrogance often grows faster than businesses. Meanwhile, Ivy began withdrawing from strategic discussions, no longer invited to certain meetings scheduled by Bianca. The fracture between partnership and hierarchy widened quietly. Graham increasingly saw himself as sole architect of success, while Ivy found herself repositioned as support staff within a company she had structurally built. What neither realized yet was that fractures, when ignored, deepen beneath the surface long before they become visible to the world. The discovery began not with confrontation, but with curiosity. Ivy had always reviewed company accounts weekly, a habit formed during the diner's fragile years. One evening, while Graham attended a strategy dinner arranged by Bianca, Ivy opened the updated financial dashboard and noticed irregular transfers categorized under consulting alignment services. The amounts were not catastrophic, but they were inconsistent with prior patterns. She traced the vendor identification number and found it linked to a recently formed advisory firm with minimal public footprint. The address listed matched a downtown office suite recently leased under Whitmore Logistics expansion umbrella. Ivy felt a tightening in her chest, not fear, but concern sharpened by intuition. She cross-referenced timestamps with scheduling logs and noticed that several transfers coincided with meetings Bianca had coordinated privately for Graham. The numbers did not scream fraud, they whispered misdirection. Instead of reacting emotionally, Ivy began compiling documentation quietly, printing transaction records and archiving correspondence. She understood that accusation without evidence would only widen fractures. So she said nothing. She watched. She calculated. Meanwhile, in a glass-walled conference room downtown, Bianca Hale sat across from her older brother, Darren Hale, discussing what she called structural consolidation. Darren, a corporate attorney with a reputation for aggressive restructuring tactics, listened carefully while reviewing preliminary drafts of amended shareholder agreements. He suggested that accelerating capital infusion required reclassifying equity stakes and streamlining voting authority. Bianca framed the conversation around efficiency, emphasizing that Graham was ambitious enough to embrace bold restructuring. Darren smirked, recognizing opportunity beneath her polished phrasing. He offered to optimize the legal framework in exchange for advisory fees channeled through his consultancy firm. Neither mentioned Ivy explicitly, yet her absence from the discussion was deliberate. Darren assured Bianca that documentation complexity alone would discourage scrutiny. They spoke in measured tones, careful not to leave obvious traces. Bianca believed she was strengthening Graham's trajectory. Darren believed he was engineering leverage. Both underestimated the quiet discipline of the woman reviewing numbers at her kitchen table miles away. At home, Graham returned late, energized by conversations about scaling operations across state lines. He spoke enthusiastically about expansion corridors and hinted at larger investors interested in rapid growth. Ivy listened attentively, offering neutral encouragement while withholding the financial irregularities she had uncovered. She asked subtle questions about advisory agreements and legal adjustments, gauging his transparency. Graham answered confidently but vaguely, brushing aside the complexity as standard industry structuring. Ivy nodded, masking the unease building beneath her calm exterior. That night, while Graham slept, she reviewed the company's original incorporation documents, papers she had helped draft during the earliest days of Whitmore Logistics. She remembered specific clauses regarding ownership distribution and capital safeguards. A quiet realization formed: whatever restructuring was underway, it had not fully accounted for her legal stake. Ivy did not yet know the scale of the unfolding strategy, but she sensed a convergence of ambition and manipulation moving beneath the surface. And she resolved, silently, to remain ahead of it. The press conference was scheduled with little notice, a deliberate move orchestrated by Bianca to maximize impact and minimize internal debate. The venue was a renovated industrial loft in downtown Burlington, transformed into a sleek stage with branded banners reading Whitmore Logistics, expanding the future of freight. Ivy learned about the event from a digital invitation forwarded by a supplier rather than from Graham himself. When she arrived quietly and stood near the back of the room, cameras were already flashing. Graham stood at the podium in a tailored suit she had never seen before, speaking confidently about multi-state expansion, new capital partnerships, and structural modernization. As he outlined ambitious growth projections, Ivy realized he was referencing strategic changes she had not approved or even fully reviewed. He announced a new corporate structure designed to attract aggressive investors, including advisory oversight managed by Darren Hale's consultancy firm. The applause was loud and immediate. Investors nodded approvingly. Ivy felt a strange detachment, as though she were watching a company she once built from the outside. She did not interrupt. She did not create a scene. She simply absorbed the shift. Arthur Whitmore stood near the refreshment table, his weathered hands clasped tightly as he listened to his son describe visionary restructuring. He caught Ivy's eye briefly, his expression conflicted. Nora stood beside him, sensing tension even if she did not fully understand its cause. Miles arrived late, having rushed from school after hearing about the announcement through colleagues. He positioned himself near Ivy, asking quietly whether she had known about the structural shift. Ivy answered with measured composure, explaining that she was still reviewing the details. On stage, Graham introduced Bianca formally as Executive Operations Director, praising her efficiency and strategic clarity. The room responded with approving murmurs. Bianca smiled graciously, her posture composed and triumphant. Ivy noticed that her own name was mentioned only once, framed vaguely as early support. The distance between origin and present leadership had been publicly redrawn. Arthur's jaw tightened as he sensed the imbalance. He had worked docs long enough to recognize when someone drifted too far from their foundation. After the event, Graham was surrounded by reporters and investors seeking interviews. Ivy waited patiently until the crowd thinned, then approached him with quiet dignity. She congratulated him first, acknowledging the boldness of the expansion. Only then did she ask for a private conversation about the revised corporate filings. Graham's smile faltered briefly, replaced by irritation masked as impatience. He insisted that timing was crucial and that formalities could be addressed later. Bianca interjected smoothly, suggesting that legal complexities were best handled through Darren's office to streamline communication. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Ivy was being repositioned away from strategic oversight. Graham accepted the framing without hesitation. As evening settled and the loft emptied, Ivy stood alone for a moment near the stage where she had once imagined standing beside him. She realized that ambition, once amplified by applause, can make accountability feel inconvenient. And beneath the celebratory glow of expansion, a deeper reckoning was quietly approaching. The investor dinner was held in a private ballroom overlooking Lake Champlain, chandeliers reflecting in the glass walls as if the entire room floated above the water. Bianca had curated the guest list carefully: regional investors, logistics executives, legal advisors, and a handful of media representatives positioned strategically near the stage. Ivy received a formal invitation this time, though the tone felt ceremonial rather than inclusive. She chose a simple navy dress, elegant but understated, refusing to compete with spectacle. As the evening progressed, Graham moved confidently from table to table, discussing projected revenue and aggressive acquisition plans. Darren Hale circulated quietly, offering legal reassurances to potential investors. When dessert was cleared and attention shifted to the podium, Graham took the stage with visible confidence. He spoke about growth, transformation, and necessary evolution. Then his tone shifted. He referenced outgrowing limitations and redefining partnerships. Ivy felt a tightening in the air before she understood the direction of his words. Graham's gaze found her in the audience. In front of investors and family alike, he declared that Whitmore Logistics had entered a new era requiring decisive leadership free from hesitation. He described past support as helpful during humble beginnings, but emphasized that ambition demanded bold, singular authority. Then, with chilling clarity, he spoke the words that would echo long after the applause faded: "You came in with nothing. You'll leave with nothing." The room fell into stunned silence. Before Ivy could process the humiliation, Bianca stepped forward with an envelope. Graham announced the filing of divorce proceedings, framing it as a necessary personal and professional realignment. Cameras flashed uncertainly. Arthur stood abruptly, disbelief etched across his weathered face. Nora's hand flew to her mouth. Miles pushed back his chair but stopped short of causing a public confrontation. Ivy remained seated, her posture steady though her heart pounded violently. She did not cry. She did not shout. She met Graham's eyes calmly, absorbing the finality of his declaration. The evening dissolved into whispers and awkward departures. Investors avoided direct eye contact, uncertain whether they had witnessed corporate restructuring or personal cruelty. Bianca maintained composure beside Graham, offering polite explanations about focus and growth. Darren spoke in low tones to concerned stakeholders, assuring them that leadership would remain stable. Ivy rose quietly, accepting the envelope without trembling. Her dignity unsettled the room more than any outburst could have. Arthur approached her first, voice thick with shame, but she reassured him gently that this was not his burden to carry. Nora wept openly, while Miles stood beside Ivy as silent reinforcement. As she stepped out of the ballroom into the cool Vermont night, the lake below appeared calm, reflecting moonlight without distortion. Inside, applause resumed hesitantly for Graham's expansion plans. Outside, Ivy inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had been dismissed publicly, stripped of acknowledgement, and told she would leave with nothing. What Graham did not understand was that she had never defined her worth by what he granted her. And humiliation, when endured with clarity, can become the beginning of something far more powerful than revenge. The house felt unfamiliar the night Ivy returned alone from the investor dinner. The walls that once echoed with shared planning sessions now held a hollow silence. She placed the envelope containing the divorce papers on the kitchen counter and stood still for several seconds, allowing the reality to settle without rushing into reaction. There were no shattered plates, no frantic phone calls, no desperate pleas. Instead, Ivy moved with quiet precision. She retrieved a single suitcase from the closet and began folding her clothes methodically. Each item carried memory, late nights drafting contracts, mornings running along the lake, quiet dinners reviewing invoices. She paused briefly in the office space where she had built the company's earliest financial models. The desk still held old notebooks filled with calculations written in her handwriting. She left them untouched. Ownership of ideas, she knew, was not erased by removal from a house. As she zipped the suitcase closed, she felt not emptiness, but clarity. Graham had mistaken quiet contribution for insignificance. The misunderstanding would soon matter more than he realized. Nora arrived unexpectedly, her face pale and eyes swollen from crying. She did not speak at first, she simply wrapped her arms around Ivy, holding her tightly as if trying to apologize for something beyond her control. Arthur stood near the doorway, shame heavy in his posture. He attempted to offer financial assistance, but Ivy declined gently. She did not want charity. She wanted independence. Miles arrived shortly after, carrying a small box for Ivy's personal documents. He avoided mentioning Graham's name, focusing instead on practical support. As they worked quietly to gather essentials, Nora whispered that she had always known Ivy was the stronger foundation in the marriage. Ivy thanked her but refrained from bitterness. She refused to let humiliation define her identity. When the suitcase was finally ready, she walked through the house one last time, not to grieve what was lost, but to acknowledge what she had built and survived. The home no longer felt like hers, but her composure remained intact. As Ivy stepped outside into the cool night air, she noticed the house lights glowing warmly behind her. It struck her that from the outside, everything still appeared stable. Appearances, she realized, are often misleading. Graham was not home. He had chosen to remain downtown after the announcement, fielding congratulatory calls and investor inquiries. His absence made the departure simpler. Miles loaded the suitcase into his car without ceremony. Ivy turned the house key over in her palm for a moment before placing it carefully on the porch railing. She did not slam doors or leave messages. She simply walked away. The drive through quiet Vermont streets felt surreal, headlights cutting through darkness that seemed both heavy and cleansing. She had been told she would leave with nothing. Yet as she watched the town lights pass by, she recognized something powerful within herself: discipline, knowledge, resilience, and legal awareness that no public humiliation could erase. The exit was not defeat. It was repositioning. And though Graham celebrated what he believed was liberation, he had unknowingly set into motion a reckoning far beyond the ballroom applause. The apartment above Claudia Reeves' bakery smelled permanently of cinnamon and rising dough, a comforting contrast to the polished coldness of corporate ballrooms. Ivy moved in with little more than her suitcase, a laptop, and a box of personal documents Miles had safeguarded. The space was small, slanted ceilings, narrow windows overlooking Main Street, but it felt honest. Claudia refused to charge full rent, though Ivy insisted on contributing what she could. Every morning before sunrise, Ivy ran along the quiet streets, letting the rhythm of her steps restore mental clarity. She avoided scrolling through headlines about Whitmore Logistics' rapid expansion and instead focused on rebuilding her own foundation. Using savings she had kept separate from shared accounts, she registered as an independent financial consultant specializing in small business stabilization. Her first clients were local. Claudia's bakery needed help restructuring supplier contracts, and a struggling hardware store required cost flow realignment. Ivy worked quietly, meticulously, often accepting delayed payments in exchange for long-term viability. Reinvention did not come with fanfare. It came with discipline, spreadsheets, and steady resilience. Word spread gradually. Ivy's reputation in town had never been tied to Graham's name. It had been built through years of visible competence at the diner and later through whispered knowledge of her financial acumen. Small business owners began seeking her advice discreetly, impressed by how she turned chaotic ledgers into structured recovery plans. She did not advertise aggressively, she let results speak. At night, while the bakery ovens cooled downstairs, Ivy reviewed cash flow charts and drafted sustainability models for clients who feared bankruptcy. The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling. For the first time in years, her expertise stood unfiltered by someone else's ambition. Meanwhile, Graham's expansion continued making headlines, but subtle reports hinted at aggressive spending patterns and accelerated acquisitions. Ivy did not dwell on them. She focused instead on refining her methodology, building templates that could one day support a larger consultancy. Claudia often reminded her that dignity restored quietly is more powerful than revenge enacted loudly. Ivy absorbed the lesson without resentment. Yet reinvention was not without hardship. There were nights when doubt crept in, moments when Ivy questioned whether she had misjudged Graham's capacity for cruelty or her own tolerance for sacrifice. Financial independence required discipline. Freelance consulting lacked the predictable salary she once enjoyed indirectly through Whitmore Logistics. She budgeted carefully, tracking every expense, refusing to compromise her autonomy again. Eleanor visited occasionally, bringing homemade soup and reassurance that strength often reveals itself through adversity. Miles checked in regularly, careful not to relay unnecessary details about Graham's life. Ivy appreciated the restraint. She was not rebuilding to compete, she was rebuilding to stand. Above the bakery, in a modest apartment lit by a single desk lamp, she began drafting a structured framework for small business advisory services, risk management, debt containment, operational resilience. It was only a blueprint for now, but it was hers. And though Graham believed he had stripped her of everything, Ivy understood something he did not. When a person possesses knowledge, discipline, and integrity, they never truly leave with nothing. The meeting with Elias Thornfield happened unexpectedly on a gray Tuesday afternoon in Claudia's bakery, between the scent of warm bread and the hum of the espresso machine. Elias was older, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with quiet authority that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. He introduced himself politely and asked if Ivy Whitmore was available for a brief consultation. Ivy recognized the name immediately. Elias Thornfield was a respected strategic investor known for revitalizing mid-sized companies without dismantling their core identity. She invited him upstairs to her modest office space, curious but composed. Elias did not waste time with pleasantries. He explained that years earlier, he had reviewed incorporation filings for emerging regional freight companies, including Whitmore Logistics. At the time, he had been evaluating potential future investments. He remembered something specific, an unusually balanced ownership clause that protected co-founders from unilateral restructuring. Ivy felt a flicker of recognition as he spoke. She had drafted that clause herself during the company's earliest formation. Elias leaned forward and placed a folder on the desk. Inside were copies of the original registration documents, legally stamped and archived. He pointed to the equity distribution section, highlighting a provision that guaranteed Ivy a 48% ownership stake with voting protections requiring her explicit written consent for major structural changes. He explained calmly that recent filings suggested significant restructuring had occurred without proper dual authorization. Ivy's pulse quickened, though her expression remained steady. She had suspected irregularities but had not yet confirmed the legal implications. Elias clarified that while Graham publicly framed expansion as singular leadership, the foundational documentation legally recognized Ivy as nearly equal partner. Any attempt to dilute her stake without documented consent could be contested. The room felt suddenly smaller, heavier with revelation. Ivy had left the ballroom believing she was stripped of professional standing. In reality, she remained legally embedded in the company's core framework. Elias's motives were measured but transparent. He admitted he had not intervened earlier because he had been observing Whitmore Logistics from a distance, evaluating its stability. However, the aggressive expansion and visible personal rupture raised concerns about governance integrity. He believed the company's long-term viability depended on lawful structure and disciplined oversight. He asked Ivy whether she intended to assert her rights. Ivy did not answer immediately. She looked at the folder, recalling every late-night drafting session that had produced those clauses. She had protected the company from impulsive decisions long before she needed protection herself. Elias concluded by stating that if she chose to act, he would support a lawful review of the restructuring process. After he left, Ivy sat quietly, absorbing the magnitude of what she had learned. Graham believed she had left with nothing. Yet legally, strategically, and structurally, she remained bound to the company's very spine. The humiliation at the ballroom had not erased her standing, it had merely obscured it. And now, the quiet discipline she had carried for years was about to intersect with opportunity in a way Graham never anticipated. The first signs of trouble appeared not in headlines, but in supplier calls that grew increasingly tense. Graham had accelerated expansion across 3 neighboring states, signing aggressive contracts that required high-volume fulfillment without the operational buffer Ivy once insisted upon. Fuel costs surged unexpectedly, and projected margins narrowed dangerously. Bianca assured investors that temporary volatility was normal during scaling, but behind closed doors the financial strain became harder to mask. Vendors began requesting expedited payments, and internal payroll projections grew unstable. Darren Hale reassured Graham that legal restructuring would shield personal exposure, though his tone carried subtle urgency. The very safeguards Ivy once implemented had been bypassed in pursuit of rapid growth. What had appeared bold now felt precarious. Graham dismissed early warnings, convinced that momentum alone would stabilize revenue streams. Yet momentum without structural integrity rarely sustains itself under pressure. The breaking point arrived during an internal audit requested by a cautious minority investor who had grown uneasy about irregular reporting. The audit uncovered a pattern of consulting payments routed through Darren Hale's advisory firm at rates far exceeding market value. Some of the funds appeared to be redirected toward private holding accounts tied indirectly to shell entities. Graham confronted Darren privately, initially defensive but increasingly unsettled as documentation surfaced. Darren framed the transactions as strategic retention fees and crisis management buffers, yet the numbers suggested systematic siphoning rather than advisory oversight. Bianca, who had once championed Darren's involvement, began to panic quietly. She realized the legal complexity she admired might also implicate her proximity to the transactions. Investors, sensing instability, started distancing themselves, citing governance concerns. The press caught wind of internal discrepancies, and speculation replaced applause. Meanwhile, Ivy learned of the unfolding instability through Elias Thornfield, who monitored developments closely. He informed her that the audit's findings strengthened the legal argument regarding unauthorized restructuring. The company's financial collapse was not yet public, but its foundations were trembling. Graham, once buoyed by investor praise, now faced mounting scrutiny from stakeholders demanding transparency. Bianca's polished composure began to crack under pressure, and Darren's assurances sounded increasingly self-serving. For the first time since the ballroom humiliation, Graham experienced a flicker of doubt about the rapid path he had chosen. The empire he had rushed to build was showing fractures at its core. And far from the downtown office chaos, Ivy remained composed, reviewing documents with steady clarity. She had not engineered the collapse, but she recognized its anatomy intimately. When structural discipline is abandoned for ego, failure is not sudden, it is cumulative. And Whitmore Logistics was now approaching its reckoning. The pre-hearing conference took place in a quiet Burlington courthouse, far from the spectacle of investor dinners and press conferences. Ivy arrived early, dressed in a simple charcoal suit, carrying a structured binder containing incorporation documents, transaction records, and correspondence she had archived meticulously over months. Elias Thornfield sat beside her, not as a spectacle but as strategic reinforcement. Across the hallway, Graham stood with Darren Hale, tension visible in the rigid set of his shoulders. Bianca remained several steps behind them, her expression guarded. When the legal mediator called the parties into the conference room, the atmosphere shifted from personal history to procedural scrutiny. Ivy did not speak emotionally. She presented documentation calmly, highlighting the original 48% ownership clause and the explicit consent requirements for structural amendments. The mediator reviewed the clauses carefully, raising immediate concerns about whether proper authorization had been obtained. Graham's confidence faltered as he realized the legal foundation he had assumed was fully under his control had not been dismantled as easily as he believed. Darren attempted to argue that expedited corporate restructuring allowed for provisional amendments under emergency growth provisions. However, Ivy countered by referencing specific language within the incorporation agreement that nullified unilateral reclassification of voting shares without dual signatory approval. Her preparation was precise, unemotional, and devastatingly clear. The room grew quiet as documentation contradicted Darren's narrative. The mediator advised that further judicial review would be necessary, and preliminary findings suggested potential breach of fiduciary responsibility. Outside the courthouse, news began circulating among investors that Whitmore Logistics faced not only financial instability but internal governance disputes. Graham looked at Ivy for the first time in weeks without arrogance. He appeared confused, even betrayed, as though her legal assertion was unexpected aggression rather than structural accountability. Ivy met his gaze calmly. She was not attacking, she was asserting what had always been hers. The awakening was not about revenge, it was about recognition of legal reality. As proceedings continued, a new presence entered the unfolding situation, Detective Rowan Pierce, assigned to review financial irregularities identified during the internal audit. Rowan requested access to transaction records connected to Darren Hale's consultancy firm. The investigation shifted from civil dispute to potential criminal inquiry. Bianca's composure began eroding under questioning, and Darren's legal bravado softened when confronted with forensic accounting evidence. Graham found himself caught between collapsing expansion, legal challenge, and criminal scrutiny of his chosen advisors. For the first time, he understood the depth of the structural protections Ivy had embedded in the company's foundation years earlier. She had not merely balanced spreadsheets, she had safeguarded integrity. As the courthouse emptied that afternoon, Ivy stepped outside into crisp autumn air feeling something unfamiliar yet steady, empowerment without bitterness. The humiliation at the ballroom had stripped her publicly, but here, in a room governed by law rather than applause, truth carried weight. And Whitmore Logistics was no longer under singular control, no matter how loudly it had once been declared. The tension inside Whitmore Logistics' downtown office became suffocating as the investigation deepened. Employees whispered in hallways, uncertain whether paychecks would clear or whether layoffs were imminent. Bianca Hale, once poised and impeccably confident, now avoided eye contact with staff who had begun questioning leadership decisions. Detective Rowan Pierce returned with additional subpoenas requesting detailed correspondence between Darren Hale and senior executives. Under pressure, Bianca realized her proximity to the questionable advisory contracts placed her dangerously close to liability. She had admired power and ambition, but she had not intended to be collateral damage in potential fraud. In a private meeting with Graham, she attempted to frame Darren's actions as independent overreach, insisting she had trusted her brother's expertise. Graham listened with visible strain. The loyalty he once placed in Bianca began unraveling as he recognized how deeply Darren's restructuring had altered the company's stability. Bianca sensed the shift immediately. She had aligned herself with strength, and now that strength was cracking. Faced with mounting evidence, Bianca made a decision that surprised even herself. She agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing internal emails and advisory agreements that revealed Darren had orchestrated complex fee redirections without full disclosure to Graham. The documents showed deliberate inflation of consulting charges and strategic manipulation of restructuring language to benefit private accounts. Graham felt the betrayal acutely, not only from Darren but from his own willingness to bypass Ivy's disciplined oversight. Bianca's cooperation did not absolve her, but it shifted the investigative lens squarely onto Darren's legal engineering. In an unexpected twist, Graham began reviewing archived financial models Ivy had created during the company's early years. He saw clearly how her conservative projections had protected them from precisely this type of collapse. The realization did not restore what he had destroyed, but it dismantled the illusion that he had built the empire alone. For the first time, humility began replacing arrogance. Meanwhile, Ivy remained outside the office turmoil, focusing on legal proceedings with steady resolve. She learned through Elias that Bianca's cooperation had strengthened the case against Darren significantly. Rather than feeling vindicated, Ivy experienced a sober clarity about the consequences of unchecked ambition. Graham had sought rapid validation and entrusted legal power to those who prioritized leverage over integrity. Now, internal betrayal was dismantling the structure he once believed invincible. Miles visited Ivy one evening, updating her cautiously about the company's internal atmosphere. He described Graham as exhausted and visibly shaken, no longer projecting unshakable confidence. Ivy listened without triumph. She had not orchestrated the unraveling, she had simply refused to disappear. Betrayal within the company exposed more than financial misconduct, it exposed the fragility of leadership built on ego rather than partnership. And as legal momentum shifted, the foundation Ivy once strengthened was being reclaimed not through noise, but through accountability. The family meeting took place in Arthur and Nora's modest living room, the same room where Graham and Miles had once studied for school exams under their father's quiet supervision. The atmosphere was tense but resolute. Arthur had remained mostly silent throughout the public humiliation, the audit revelations, and the courthouse proceedings. But silence had never meant indifference. That evening, he asked Graham to sit across from him without advisors, without Bianca, without legal counsel. Ivy arrived reluctantly at Nora's request, uncertain what role she was expected to play. Miles stood near the fireplace, arms folded, protective but composed. Arthur spoke slowly, choosing words shaped by decades of physical labor and hard-earned humility. He told Graham that success built on dismissal of loyalty was unstable. He acknowledged his pride in Graham's ambition but expressed deeper pride in integrity, a trait he believed Ivy had embodied from the beginning. The room grew quiet as Graham absorbed his father's disappointment. For the first time, the weight of family judgment felt heavier than investor scrutiny. Arthur then did something no one anticipated. He publicly declared, within the family circle, that if the matter escalated to formal board restructuring, he would testify in support of Ivy's rightful ownership stake. His position as early informal investor and documented witness to the company's formation gave his words significance. Nora nodded in agreement, her gentle demeanor firm for once. Miles added that ethical accountability required standing with truth, not blood alone. Graham felt the isolation sharply. The empire he once believed defined him now seemed secondary to the erosion of trust within his own family. Ivy did not gloat. She acknowledged Arthur's stance with gratitude but emphasized that her pursuit was not revenge, it was restoration of lawful structure. The family fracture widened in that moment, but it also clarified loyalties. Ambition had once united them, integrity now divided them. After the meeting, Graham stepped outside into the cold Vermont evening alone. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, mirroring the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. Inside, Ivy spoke quietly with Nora, reassuring her that whatever happened next would not be fueled by bitterness. She understood that power regained through spite corrodes quickly. Miles remained by the window, watching his brother's solitary silhouette. He recognized the beginning of humility in Graham's posture, though humility born from consequence is rarely comfortable. Arthur's stand had shifted the moral axis of the conflict. What began as public humiliation had evolved into a reckoning not only legal but personal. And as Whitmore Logistics teetered between collapse and restructuring, it was no longer applause or expansion defining its fate. It was accountability, within boardrooms and within family walls alike. The emergency board meeting convened in the same downtown loft where Graham had once announced expansion with applause echoing against glass walls. This time, the atmosphere carried no glamour. Investors sat rigidly, legal advisors flanked the room, and Detective Rowan Pierce observed quietly from the back. Ivy entered without spectacle, accompanied by Elias Thornfield, whose presence alone shifted the balance of influence. Graham remained seated at the head of the table out of habit rather than authority. Darren Hale was absent, facing formal charges related to financial misconduct. Bianca sat silently, no longer projecting polished dominance but cautious compliance. When proceedings began, the chairperson requested clarification regarding disputed ownership and restructuring validity. Ivy spoke first, presenting documented evidence of her 48% stake and the unauthorized dilution attempts. Then Elias Thornfield rose, revealing a truth that stunned even seasoned investors. Elias disclosed that he had quietly acquired additional shares from early minority stakeholders during the company's formative years, shares he never publicly disclosed because he had been evaluating long-term governance integrity. His investment decision, he explained, was not solely financial. Years earlier, before Whitmore Logistics had secured its first major contract, Ivy had anonymously advised one of his struggling family-owned distribution firms on cost stabilization strategies through a community outreach forum. That advice had prevented his company from collapsing during a volatile market shift. He never forgot the discipline and foresight behind those recommendations. When he later reviewed Whitmore Logistics Incorporation documents and recognized Ivy's legal acumen embedded within them, he chose to monitor the company quietly. Now, with her legal stake combined with his accumulated shares, they collectively held controlling interest. The room absorbed the implication in stunned silence. Control had shifted, not through sabotage, but through foresight and quiet alliances formed long before public recognition. The chairperson called for a vote to determine leadership continuity. The outcome was decisive. Graham was formally removed as CEO pending resolution of fiduciary concerns and governance restructuring. Ivy, by lawful right and majority alignment, assumed interim controlling authority with Elias as strategic advisor. No applause followed, only a heavy, sober acknowledgement of structural reality. Graham sat motionless, processing the magnitude of reversal. The very clauses he once dismissed as formalities had preserved Ivy's standing and invited alliance with a powerful investor he never saw coming. Bianca lowered her gaze, understanding that proximity to ambition had not secured permanence. As the meeting adjourned, Ivy did not celebrate. She simply gathered her documents with calm precision. The humiliation at the investor dinner had declared she would leave with nothing. Yet here, in the same city, in a room governed by votes rather than vanity, she stood not as discarded partner, but as controlling shareholder. The ultimate twist was not vengeance. It was revelation. Power secured through integrity endures longer than power seized through ego. The courtroom was quieter than the boardroom had been, yet the gravity felt heavier. Darren Hale stood before the judge, no longer the confident corporate attorney orchestrating complex restructurings, but a defendant facing charges tied to financial misconduct and fiduciary manipulation. Bianca testified with measured honesty, acknowledging her role in facilitating introductions and administrative processes while distancing herself from intentional wrongdoing. Detective Rowan Pierce presented forensic accounting reports that mapped the flow of inflated advisory fees into shell entities Darren controlled. The evidence was clinical, precise, undeniable. Graham sat in the gallery, watching the unraveling of a man he once trusted with expansion strategy. Arthur and Nora were present too, not for spectacle but for closure. When the sentence was delivered, it carried both legal consequence and public acknowledgement of breach of trust. Darren's calculated leverage had collapsed under scrutiny, exposing the fragile architecture of ambition built on shortcuts. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, expecting dramatic statements. Ivy declined interviews, choosing restraint over visibility. She had not sought Darren's downfall, she had sought structural correction. Bianca approached Ivy quietly near the courthouse steps, her voice subdued. She admitted that admiration for power had clouded her judgment and that she underestimated Ivy's long-term foresight. Ivy accepted the apology without embracing it fully. Forgiveness, she understood, did not require reconciliation. Graham waited until the crowd thinned before stepping forward. The confidence that once defined him had softened into something more honest. He apologized, not with excuses, but with recognition. He admitted that he had mistaken visibility for value and applause for authority. Ivy listened calmly. She did not interrupt, nor did she rush to absolve him. She simply acknowledged the truth in his words. Accountability, she knew, was a beginning, not a conclusion. That evening, Graham returned to his parents' home temporarily, humbled and uncertain about his next chapter. Miles offered quiet support, reminding him that identity built solely on title dissolves quickly. Meanwhile, Ivy reviewed final governance documents that formalized her leadership position and outlined transparent operational reforms. Elias Thornfield remained steady beside her, advising patience and long-term stabilization rather than aggressive dominance. The company's future would not mirror its past, it would be rebuilt deliberately. As the sun set over Lake Champlain, Ivy stood briefly at the water's edge, reflecting on how swiftly humiliation had transformed into accountability. She felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only clarity. Justice had unfolded not through revenge, but through law and discipline. And though the public narrative framed the events as dramatic reversal, Ivy understood the deeper truth: systems rooted in integrity ultimately correct themselves. Accountability had arrived, and with it, the space for something entirely new to begin. The launch of Whitmore Advisory Group did not take place in a ballroom or beneath flashing cameras. It began quietly in a renovated brick office overlooking the same Vermont streets where Ivy once ran before sunrise to clear her thoughts. The space was modest but intentional: clean lines, organized files, a conference table built from reclaimed wood she restored herself. Claudia provided catering from her bakery for the small open house gathering, while Miles helped arrange chairs with practical enthusiasm. Arthur and Nora stood proudly near the window, observing not with fanfare but with quiet admiration. Elias Thornfield attended discreetly, offering strategic support without overshadowing the moment. Ivy addressed the small crowd not with dramatic declarations but with steady conviction. She outlined her mission: to help family-owned businesses implement sustainable growth structures rooted in discipline rather than spectacle. Her voice carried calm authority shaped by experience rather than ego. The room felt grounded, purposeful. This was not an empire announcement, it was a commitment to stability. Meanwhile, Graham began rebuilding from a humbler starting point. Under Miles' encouragement, he accepted a consulting role at a regional distribution firm, focusing on operational efficiency rather than executive title. The transition was not easy. He had grown accustomed to leading rooms rather than learning quietly within them. Yet humility reshaped his perspective. He began revisiting the financial models Ivy once drafted, recognizing their foresight more clearly now that ego no longer filtered his vision. He met with Arthur frequently, discussing discipline, patience, and long-term credibility. The applause he once chased felt distant, replaced by the steady rhythm of responsible work. He did not attempt reconciliation beyond what had already been acknowledged. Instead, he focused on becoming worthy of respect rather than demanding it. Bianca relocated to another state, choosing to rebuild her career away from the shadow of scandal. The town moved forward gradually, gossip fading as stability returned. One crisp autumn morning, Ivy stood on a hillside overlooking the lake as the sun rose in quiet brilliance. The air was cool, the horizon steady. She reflected not on humiliation or victory, but on endurance. She had been told she would leave with nothing. Yet she carried knowledge, resilience, and integrity, assets no courtroom could strip away. Whitmore Advisory Group had already secured its first long-term clients, small businesses grateful for structure and clarity. Eleanor joined her on the hill, wrapping a scarf around her shoulders with maternal tenderness. Ivy felt no need for public validation. Her worth had never depended on who recognized it. As the sunlight expanded across the water, she understood the lesson woven through every chapter of her journey: self-worth is not defined by what someone attempts to take from you, but by what remains when you stand firm. The future ahead was not loud or theatrical. It was deliberate, steady, and entirely hers. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.